The October wind bit with a raw chill, stripping the last defiant leaves from the oak trees lining Elm Street. Detective Miles Corbin pulled his worn trench coat tighter, the fabric offering little comfort against the biting cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. Rain, a fine, persistent drizzle, had just begun to fall, slicking the already grimy pavements of Oakhaven, a town still clinging to its fading industrial glory in upstate New York. The neon sign of the old diner across the street, Pop's Eats, flickered erratically, casting an anemic pink glow that did little to dispel the gloom. It was a town that felt perpetually on the cusp of something. Decline, revelation, perhaps both. Miles had been with the Oakhaven Police Department for 15 years, long enough to know the rhythm of the town, the unspoken fears lurking beneath its quiet surface. Most days, his job involved domestic disputes, petty theft, and the occasional bar fight that escalated into something uglier. But tonight was different. Tonight, the call had come from an abandoned storefront on the edge of the old manufacturing district, a place that had been vacant for at least a decade, ever since Belle's boutique had shuttered its doors for good. The building itself was a relic, a two-story brick structure with large, dust-streaked display windows that reflected the dreary street like vacant eyes. Sergeant Reyes, a younger officer with a perpetually anxious furrow in his brow, met Miles at the yellow crime scene tape. "Detective, glad you're here. This one, it's a bit much." Reyes ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his gaze darting back to the darkened storefront. "What's a bit much, Reyes?" Another squatter found a dead pigeon. Miles tried for a lightness he didn't feel. His stomach, already churning from the 3 cups of lukewarm coffee he'd had at the precinct, tightened further. "No, sir. Not exactly." Reyes swallowed hard. A group of kids, they dared each other to go inside. Said they heard something, saw something. One of them actually went in, then came screaming out like he'd seen a ghost. Miles sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Teenagers and abandoned buildings were a classic recipe for false alarms and exaggerated tales. And what did they claim to see? They were pretty incoherent, but the one who went inside, a kid named Timmy Jenkins, he kept repeating something about a mannequin and eyes. Miles pushed past the tape, the fluorescent beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness within. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness that was almost floral, yet deeply unsettling. The floorboards creaked ominously under his weight. Belle's boutique had once sold women's clothing, and the lingering ghosts of polished mannequins and delicate fabrics seemed to hang in the stale air. Empty display cases lined the walls, and a thick layer of dust coated everything, giving the interior a ghostly, muted appearance. He moved slowly, his senses on high alert. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere deeper within the building. Reyes followed close behind, his breathing shallow. "Where exactly, Reyes?" Miles kept his voice low, the words feeling swallowed by the vast silent space. "Up front, sir. One of the main display windows." Reyes pointed with a trembling finger towards a shadowy alcove to their left, partially obscured by a tattered velvet curtain. Miles advanced, his flashlight beam sweeping across cobweb-draped walls and the skeletal remains of clothes racks. As he rounded the corner into the alcove, the beam settled on it. It was a mannequin, undeniably, but unlike any mannequin Miles had ever seen. It stood rigidly, posed as if admiring a dress that no longer existed, its slender, pale form draped in what looked like a faded turn-of-the-century evening gown, the fabric brittle and moth-eaten. Its hair, a shocking auburn, was styled in an elaborate updo, unnaturally vibrant against the drab surroundings. But it wasn't the mannequin itself that made Reyes stutter, and the hair on Miles's arms stand on end. It was the face. The skin was too lifelike, smooth and pale, with a faint blush on the cheeks that seemed utterly out of place in such a desolate setting. The lips were painted a delicate rose, slightly parted as if caught mid-sentence. And then there were the eyes. They were made of glass, undoubtedly. Perfect, iridescent glass set into the lifelike face. But they weren't the blank, vacant stares of typical mannequins. These eyes, a startling shade of blue, seemed to hold an expression, wide, fixed, and imbued with an unsettling, desperate plea. They were turned slightly towards the entrance, as if silently witnessing something horrific unfold, a silent scream trapped behind the polished surface. Miles felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't just some forgotten display. There was something profoundly wrong. The level of detail, the chilling realism of the features, transcended mere retail display. He leaned closer, his flashlight beam steady on the face. The faint, sweet floral scent was stronger here, almost overwhelming, mingling with the metallic tang of old dust. He noticed the small, almost imperceptible details that sent a fresh wave of unease through him. The delicate lines etched around the glass eyes, resembling faint crow's feet. The tiny mole just above the left corner of the mannequin's mouth. These were not generic features. They were specific, almost individual. "Is it new?" Reyes whispered, his voice barely audible. "I mean, did someone put it here recently?" Miles shook his head slowly. "Doesn't look like it. The dust cover is uniform. It's been here a while. A long while by the looks of it." He reached out a gloved hand, hesitantly touching the fabric of the gown. It felt brittle like old paper. He stepped back, trying to gain perspective. The entire display, the mannequin, the dress, the pose, it was meticulously arranged, almost artistic, yet deeply macabre. It felt like a perverse museum exhibit, a frozen moment in time meant to evoke something far more profound than the desire to purchase a dress. "Who owns this building, Reyes?" Miles asked, his voice low and strained. "Records are messy, sir. It's been through a few hands. Last known owner was a holding company based out of Buffalo. Been derelict for ages, like I said." Miles circled the mannequin slowly, his flashlight beam meticulously examining every detail. He noticed the base, a heavy, ornate pedestal, also covered in a uniform layer of dust. The entire arrangement seemed undisturbed, a tableau frozen in time. Yet those eyes, those terrifyingly expressive glass eyes, they continued to stare, to beg, to silently accuse. He pulled out his phone, snapping a few preliminary photos, the flash momentarily illuminating the chilling scene in stark, unforgiving light. The more he looked, the more the initial shock gave way to a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't just a lifelike mannequin. It felt like a monument to something lost, something taken. "Get CSU out here, Reyes, and forensics. I want this place sealed tighter than Fort Knox. Nobody touches anything. And I mean anything." Miles's voice was firm, cutting through the eerie silence. "And start digging into this building's history. Every owner, every tenant, every damn report of anything unusual in the vicinity for the last 20 years. I want to know everything." Reyes nodded, already fumbling for his radio, his face pale in the dim light. Miles turned back to the mannequin. The glass eyes, still fixed on him, seemed to follow his movements. In the sudden stillness, amidst the dust and the decaying grandeur of the old boutique, Miles could almost hear a faint, unspoken whisper, an echo from the past, pleading for him to understand. This wasn't just a mannequin. This was a story waiting to be told, a mystery begging to be unraveled. And something told Miles, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the truth behind Emily Clark's preserved gaze would be far more horrifying than anything Oakhaven had ever witnessed. He took a deep breath, the sweet, cloying scent of the room filling his lungs. It was then, as his gaze moved from the mannequin's face down to its slender, almost fragile hand, that he saw it, barely visible beneath the cuff of the moth-eaten gown, a faint, almost imperceptible scratch on the pale, smooth skin of the mannequin's wrist. It was too precise, too deliberate to be a random blemish. It looked like the faint, faded outline of a single etched letter, an E. Miles felt the blood drain from his face. This was no ordinary mannequin. This was a message, and the girl with the glass eyes, Emily Clark, was somehow at the heart of it. The morning light, thin and watery, did little to brighten the mood in the precinct's break room. Miles sat hunched over a styrofoam cup of coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to dispel the fatigue that had settled deep in his bones. The image of the mannequin, with its uncanny realism and pleading glass eyes, was seared into his mind. The E etched on its wrist felt less like a clue and more like a taunt, a silent scream preserved for decades. Sergeant Reyes, looking equally exhausted, dropped a thick manila folder on the table. The dust from the abandoned boutique still clung to his uniform. "You won't believe this, Detective." Miles looked up, his expression grim. "Try me. I went through the old case files just like you said. Had to get a few from the archives, and I found it. A missing persons report, filed 18 years ago. The girl's name, Emily Clark." Miles felt a jolt of cold realization. He opened the file, his fingers fumbling slightly. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman with a cascade of reddish auburn hair and striking blue eyes. The resemblance was uncanny, almost identical. The same wide-set eyes, the same delicate curve of the lips, the same small mole just above her mouth. It was her, the girl in the mannequin. The report detailed the disappearance of 18-year-old Emily Clark. She had vanished without a trace in the spring of 2007, just a few weeks after graduating from Oakhaven High School. Her car was found abandoned on the side of a rural road, and a massive search effort had yielded nothing. The case had gone cold, another unsolved mystery in a town with too many of them. "Her family," Reyes said, his voice hushed. "They lived on the outskirts of town. Her father, Thomas Clark, was a carpenter. Her mother, Eleanor, was an art teacher at the local high school. They moved away a year after she disappeared. Couldn't bear to live here anymore." Miles studied the file. The details were sparse. Emily was described as quiet, a talented artist, and had a small, close-knit group of friends. She had been planning to attend art school in the city. Her disappearance had been a local tragedy, a story that still haunted the older residents. "Any connection to the boutique?" Miles asked, his mind racing. "Bell's Boutique? That's the thing, sir. The owner of the boutique at the time of Emily's disappearance was a woman named Clara Vance. She was a recluse, known for being peculiar. She had a reputation for creating custom mannequins and displays for other stores in the area. She even had a small studio in the back of her boutique. The building was her home, her life's work, a kind of private museum. She died 3 years ago, alone of natural causes. Her only living relative was a distant nephew who sold the property site unseen to the holding company." Miles leaned back, the pieces beginning to form a chilling pattern. So Clara Vance was a mannequin maker, and Emily Clark, a talented art student, disappears 18 years ago. The mannequin, a chillingly lifelike replica of Emily, is found in Vance's boutique. It's too specific to be a coincidence. But why? Reyes's brow was still furrowed. Why would she do that? And why would it go undiscovered for so long? The police searched that place back then, didn't they? The report says they did a perfunctory search, but the building was so cluttered and filled with her strange creations, they probably didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Or maybe they just missed it, Miles said, the bitter taste of departmental failure on his tongue. He knew how easily things could be overlooked in a chaotic investigation. The mannequins were probably a dime a dozen in there. Or maybe it wasn't there then. Reyes's eyes widened. You think she put it there later? I don't know, Miles admitted. But what if the mannequin isn't just a replica? What if it's a representation of something more sinister? The level of detail, the hair, the eyes, the mole. It's too perfect. Someone had to have a deep personal knowledge of Emily to create something so specific. A friend, an acquaintance, maybe someone she trusted. Miles looked back at the file, at Emily's smiling face in the photograph. The case had been labeled missing, presumed deceased, but with no body, no evidence of foul play. It had simply faded into the town's collective memory, a sad story about a girl who just disappeared. Now that story had a new, terrifying twist. We need to find out everything we can about Clara Vance, Miles said, his voice filled with renewed purpose. Her life, her habits, her associates, especially the people she might have known in common with Emily. And we need to find those friends of Emily's, the ones mentioned in the file. See what they remember. The rest of the day was a blur of interviews and research. Miles and Reyes spoke to retired officers who had worked the original case, but their memories were hazy. The case was just another cold one, buried under years of routine police work. They went to the local library, poring over old newspaper archives. They found articles about Emily's disappearance and a brief, almost dismissive obituary for Clara Vance. There was nothing to suggest a connection. Later that evening, Miles sat alone in his office, a topographical map of Oakhaven spread out on his desk. He traced the route from Emily's home to the location where her car was found, and then to Belle's boutique. The distances were all manageable, within a few miles of each other. It was a small town. Everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. His phone buzzed. It was Reyes. Sir, I just got off the phone with one of Emily's old friends, a woman named Jessica Thompson. She's a high school teacher in the next town over. She remembers Emily well. She agreed to meet with us tomorrow morning. She said she has something she thinks we might want to see. Something Emily gave her before she disappeared. Miles's heart hammered a little faster. A lead. After 18 years of silence, a new thread had been pulled from the tangled, dusty fabric of the past. He looked back at the photograph of Emily Clark. Her smiling face seemed to hold a different kind of expression now, one of hope, a desperate desire for the truth to finally come to light. The mannequin in the storefront wasn't just a grim curiosity, it was a key. It was a plea, and Miles was going to answer it. The next morning the air was still cold, but the rain had stopped, replaced by a grey, overcast sky. Jessica Thompson lived in a modest house in a neighboring town, a quiet suburban street where the houses looked a little too perfect. She was a woman in her late 30s, with tired eyes and a kind but guarded demeanor. The years had clearly done nothing to erase the pain of her friend's disappearance. She led Miles and Reyes into her living room, a space filled with family photos and the scent of freshly brewed coffee. "Thank you for meeting with us, Ms. Thompson," Miles said, his voice gentle. "We appreciate your time. We're reopening Emily's case." Jessica's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "I've been waiting for this for 18 years, Detective. I never stopped thinking about her. She was my best friend." She paused, her gaze distant. "The police back then, they didn't really believe us. They said she probably just ran away, but Emily wouldn't have done that. She had her whole life planned." "Did she ever mention anyone who might have been a danger to her?" Reyes asked. Jessica shook her head. "No, nothing like that. She was a little withdrawn, maybe a little stressed about college applications, but nothing serious. She had a passion for art. That's all she ever talked about." "Did she ever mention Clara Vance or Belle's boutique?" Miles asked, watching her closely. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Clara Vance. Emily knew her. She admired her work. Clara was this eccentric old lady who lived and worked in that strange old store. Emily used to go there all the time. She said the mannequins Clara made were works of art, not just store dummies. She was fascinated by her. They would talk for hours, apparently. Emily said Clara was a little odd, but a genius in her own way. This was the connection they had been searching for. Emily, the aspiring artist, had been drawn to the reclusive artisan. The relationship on the surface seemed innocent enough, but something about the image of the lifelike mannequin made Miles's skin crawl. Emily was working on a portfolio for art school. Jessica continued, her voice soft. She was trying to capture the human form, the raw emotions. She had this obsession with expression, with capturing a moment of intense feeling. She was always sketching. Jessica stood up and walked over to a small bookshelf, pulling out a large, spiral-bound sketchbook. She gave this to me just a few days before she disappeared, said she wanted me to have it in case she got into a fancy art school and forgot about her old life. A sad, small smile touched her lips. I think she was just scared about leaving home. She was always so shy. She handed the book to Miles. The cover was worn, the corners dog-eared, a testament to years of careful handling. Miles opened it with reverence. The pages were filled with exquisite pencil sketches. There were portraits of people in various emotional states. A man laughing, a woman crying, a child with an expression of pure wonder. The detail was incredible, each line and shadow conveying a depth of emotion that was both beautiful and haunting. He flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat as he came to a series of sketches. They were of a mannequin. The subject was unmistakable. The same posture, the same archaic gown, the same unsettlingly lifelike face. But the expression in the sketches was different. In the first drawing, the mannequin's face was serene, almost beautiful. The second showed a hint of sadness in the eyes. The third, a subtle tilt of the head, as if listening intently. The fourth, a look of growing unease, almost fear. And the final sketch, the last page of the book, was a charcoal drawing of the mannequin's face, its glass eyes wide, fixed, and filled with a raw, panicked terror. Miles's gaze lingered on the final drawing. It was the exact expression he had seen on the face of the mannequin in the storefront. The same desperate plea, the same silent, terrifying scream. Underneath the drawing, in Emily's small, neat handwriting, were 3 words. The final pose. Miles looked at Jessica. Did she ever tell you what these were about? Jessica shook her head, her voice a whisper. No. She just told me she was working on a new series, a collaborative project with a friend. I just thought it was part of her art school portfolio, something to do with sculpture or something. Miles closed the book, the weight of the pages feeling heavy in his hands. It wasn't just a sketchbook. It was a diary, a silent chronicle of Emily's descent into terror. The mannequin wasn't just a work of art, it was a macabre self-portrait. But why? What had happened to her? Did she have a boyfriend? Reyes asked, shifting on the sofa. Not that I know of. She wasn't really dating. She was so focused on her art. Jessica's expression was thoughtful. She did get an odd package a few weeks before she disappeared, though. She was so excited about it. Said it was a gift from a new friend, someone she met online, in an art forum. A special set of paints, I think she said. She was a little secretive about the person's identity, just said they shared her fascination with capturing emotion in art. An online forum, a new friend, a special gift. Miles felt a fresh wave of unease. Do you remember the person's name? No, she was very vague. But I do remember her saying something about their artistic philosophies being perfectly aligned. They both believed that true art was not just about replicating an image, but about capturing the soul of the subject. She said the person was a genius at it. The word genius hung in the air, a chilling echo of Jessica's earlier description of Clara Vance. Miles couldn't shake the feeling that the mannequin was not a replica of Emily Clark, but a physical manifestation of her very soul, a twisted, macabre piece of art created by someone who had truly captured her. "Thank you, Ms. Thompson," Miles said, standing up. "You've been a great help. Is there anything else you remember? Anything at all, no matter how small?" Jessica thought for a moment, her eyes welling up with tears. "Just one thing. The last time I saw her, she was so excited. She said she was going to meet her online friend for the first time. She told me she was going to be the subject of their masterpiece. I just thought she meant a painting or maybe a sculpture. She was so happy. I never saw her again." The words hung in the air, a final gut-wrenching piece of the puzzle. The collaborative project, the special paints, the final pose. It was all a prelude to something terrible, a sinister artistic endeavor. Miles held the sketchbook tightly. The answer wasn't in the cold case files. It was in the drawings, in the unspoken terror of the final pose. Emily Clark had documented her own fate, and now, 18 years later, her art had finally found an audience. Miles and Reyes left Jessica Thompson's home in a pensive silence. The sketchbook was a bombshell, a direct link between Emily and her captor. It also provided a new, horrifying theory. Emily wasn't just a victim. She had willingly, naively, walked into a trap, drawn in by the promise of an artistic collaboration. The killer, or the artist, as Miles was now beginning to think of them, had preyed on her passion. "The online forum," Reyes said, breaking the silence. "That's our next lead. We need to find it. But after 18 years, it might not even exist anymore." "It's a long shot, I know," Miles replied, "but we have to try. The person's identity might be hidden, but their digital footprint might still exist. We need a warrant for her old computer if her parents kept it. We need to get a clear picture of her digital life. Who was she talking to? What were they saying?" They spent the rest of the day tracking down Emily's parents, now living in a quiet retirement community in Florida. Miles spoke to them over the phone, his voice as gentle as he could make it. The pain in Thomas Clark's voice was palpable. He confirmed that they still had Emily's computer, a bulky desktop from the early 2000s, sitting in their attic. Miles arranged for a retrieval and shipping service, hoping the ancient hard drive would still be functional. Meanwhile, Reyes was on the phone with the county's digital forensics unit, explaining the situation. 18 years, Sergeant. This is a long shot," the technician on the other end of the line had said, but the gravity of the case had been enough to secure their cooperation. Back at the precinct, Miles dug deeper into Clara Vance's history. He found records of her small business, Belle's Boutique. It wasn't just a clothing store, it was a passion project, a labor of love. Clara had inherited the building from her parents, who had run a modest tailoring business. She had turned it into her own personal workshop, creating custom mannequins and displays, her reputation for her lifelike creations growing slowly over the years. Miles found an old local newspaper article from the Oakhaven Gazette from 20 years ago. It was a profile on Clara Vance, titled "The Mannequin Whisperer of Oakhaven." The article described her as a reclusive genius, an artist obsessed with the human form. A quote from her in the article was chillingly prescient. "The most beautiful art is not a copy of life, but a preservation of a moment, an emotion, an essence. The goal is to make the subject live forever." This was the key. Her artistic philosophy was an exact match to what Jessica had described as the philosophy of Emily's online friend. The pieces were falling into place. Clara Vance wasn't just an eccentric artisan, she was a predator, a calculating artist who saw people not as human beings, but as subjects for her twisted, macabre art. Miles felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. What if the mannequin was more than just a model? What if it was Emily herself, preserved in some horrific, lifelike form? The idea was so grotesque, so unthinkable, that he had to force himself to dismiss it. This was a rational investigation, not a B-movie plot. There had to be a more grounded, albeit still horrifying explanation. He looked back at the file on the Mannequin Whisperer. The article mentioned a small, exclusive art exhibition Clara had held in her boutique a few years before Emily's disappearance. It had been a showcase of her masterworks, a series of 5 mannequins, each one more lifelike than the last. The article gave a brief description of each piece, and Miles's blood ran cold as he read the description of the final piece in the exhibition. The centerpiece was the Muse, a strikingly lifelike mannequin of a young woman with a fiery spirit, captured in a pose of quiet contemplation. The artist refused to name her model, only calling her final and most perfect work. The date of the exhibition was 2 months before Emily's disappearance. Coincidence? Unlikely. Miles had a sickening feeling that he was looking at a list of victims, not mannequins. "Reyes," Miles said, grabbing the phone. "We need to get into that boutique again. A full forensic sweep. I want them to check the floorboards, the walls, the back studio, every square inch. And I want them to bring a cadaver dog. This has gone from a missing persons case to a suspected homicide. And I think the killer might have had more than one victim." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The old boutique was meticulously searched. The forensics team, with the help of a digital model of the interior, started a slow, methodical sweep. The cadaver dogs were brought in, and they were immediately drawn to the back studio, a small, dusty room that had clearly been Clara's private workspace. The air in there was thick with the same cloying, sweet scent Miles had first smelled. The dog's frantic sniffing and quiet barks confirmed Miles's worst fears. Something was there, or had been there. Forensics technicians meticulously lifted floorboards and dug into the dirt beneath, but they found no remains. However, they did find something else. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the back studio was a small, locked wooden chest. Miles and Reyes watched as they carefully pried it open. Inside were a series of journals, meticulously kept, in Clara Vance's elegant, spidery handwriting. The journals were a chilling and meticulous record of her obsession. She detailed her artistic process, her search for the perfect muses, and her philosophy. The entries became more and more twisted as time went on, moving from general artistic musings to a more personal, possessive tone. She wrote about the imperfections of human life, the way emotions faded, bodies aged, and beauty withered. Her goal, she wrote, was to create something eternal, something that would preserve a moment of pure, raw human emotion forever. The last few entries were the most horrifying. She wrote about her final muse, a girl who was as beautiful and passionate as she was naive. She wrote about their conversations, her admiration for Emily's art, and her plan to immortalize her. She even mentioned the sketchbook, describing it as a testament to Emily's talent, a chronicle of her journey to her final pose. The final entry, dated the day before Emily's disappearance, was the most disturbing. It was a single, chilling sentence. "The perfect vessel has been prepared. The masterpiece is almost complete." Miles felt the blood run cold in his veins. The journals confirmed it. Clara Vance had not just created a mannequin in Emily's image. She had somehow, in some horrific, calculated way, used Emily herself. But how? And where was the body? He looked at the dusty studio, the empty space where the mannequin had stood. It was all a stage, a macabre performance designed to be discovered. The mannequin was the final clue, the centerpiece of a crime that had been hidden in plain sight for 18 years. Reyes, pale and shaken, looked at Miles. What do we do now, detective? We have a confession of a sort, but we still don't have a body. We don't have a crime scene. Miles pointed to the journals. We have the motive. We have a clear pattern of behavior, and we have a chilling account of her last moments. But we're missing the how. There has to be a rational explanation. There's no magic, no hocus-pocus, just a meticulous, calculating killer. And her journals might still hold the key to where she buried the truth. Miles's mind raced. He had to think like Clara Vance. She wasn't just a killer. She was a meticulous artist. Every detail, every clue, was a deliberate part of her work. The mannequin, the journals, the E on the wrist. It was all part of a twisted artistic statement. He had to look at this not as a crime scene, but as an art installation. And if he was right, the final, most gruesome piece of the puzzle was still out there, waiting to be found. The journals of Clara Vance proved to be a goldmine of psychological insight, a roadmap into the mind of a disturbed artist. Miles and Reyes spent days poring over them, trying to decipher the cryptic and chilling entries. Clara wasn't a rambling lunatic. She was calculating, precise, and dangerously obsessive. She saw herself as an artistic visionary, and her victims as the raw material for her art. The journals chronicled her process in a horrifyingly clinical manner. She detailed her search for muses, women who possessed a specific quality she admired, be it a vibrant spirit, a serene demeanor, or a particular physical feature. She would befriend them, gain their trust, and then, under the guise of an artistic collaboration, lure them to her studio. What was missing, however, was any mention of how she carried out her horrific acts. The journals were filled with artistic philosophy and her twisted admiration for her models, but they were devoid of any technical details regarding the crimes themselves. It was as if the act of killing was a mundane footnote to the grand artistic statement she was making. The digital forensics team finally delivered their findings on Emily's old computer. The hard drive, against all odds, was functional. They had recovered a series of messages from a long-defunct art forum. Emily's username was Ember, and she had been in a prolonged private conversation with an account named The Artisan. The messages were a series of exchanges that began as a professional discussion about art and progressively devolved into something far more personal and manipulative. The Artisan praised Emily's work, her ability to capture a subject's essence. The messages were filled with flattery, with the Artisan positioning herself as a mentor, a kindred spirit. The account was meticulously crafted, luring Emily in with the promise of a collaboration that would transcend the mundane. The last message, sent just a day before Emily's disappearance, read, "Your final pose awaits, my beautiful muse. The world will finally see you as I do. A work of art, a masterpiece of eternal form." The IP address for the account was traced back to a public library computer in a neighboring town, a dead end. Miles's frustration grew. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, a confession in the form of Clara's journals, and a clear motive. But they still lacked the most critical piece of the puzzle, a body. Without it, the district attorney would have a hard time getting a conviction, even with a dead suspect. "We're missing something," Miles said, pacing his office. Clara Vance was obsessed with preservation, with making her subjects live forever. She didn't just want to kill them. She wanted to create a monument to them, a monument that was meant to be found. Reyes, who had been rereading Clara's journals, looked up. "I've been going over the detailed inventory she kept of her mannequins. She was meticulous about it. She listed every piece she ever made, her techniques, the materials she used. But there's a gap. An entire series of mannequins is listed as the Muses, but there are no details, no descriptions, no materials, no date of creation." Miles stopped pacing. "What's the date range for that series?" Reyes checked his notes. It spans from about 20 years ago up until Emily's disappearance. It overlaps with the newspaper article about the Muse exhibition. "The 5 mannequins," Miles said, the pieces clicking into place. She wasn't just creating lifelike models. She was creating a series of them, her magnum opus. The last one was Emily. But where are the others? They went back to the old records of the boutique. After Clara Vance's death, her nephew had come in and had a local auctioneer come to appraise the contents. Most of her creations were sold to antique dealers and collectors. Miles and Reyes now had to track down 5 missing mannequins, a seemingly impossible task. Miles pulled up the auction records. The descriptions were vague, but the buyers were listed. The trail led them all over the state, from a small-town museum to a private collection. They spent the next few days on the road, following the trail of Clara Vance's macabre art. The first mannequin was in a local museum, a part of a historical exhibit on early 20th century fashion. It was a beautiful, serene-looking woman in a flapper dress, with a calm, almost serene expression on her face. The museum curator said it was a gift from a private collector. The second was in a private art collection owned by a wealthy old man who lived in a sprawling estate in the countryside. The mannequin, a slender woman with her head tilted in a thoughtful pose, was displayed in a glass case in his library. The collector, a frail, elderly man, proudly showed it off, calling it a masterpiece of realism. Miles and Reyes examined each mannequin with a growing sense of dread. Each one was as lifelike as the one in the boutique, but each had a different, subtle expression. One was serene, another contemplative, another melancholy, and another pensive. They were all beautiful, yet profoundly unsettling. They were more than models, they were portraits of captured emotions. Miles couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at 5 different victims. The serene woman, the contemplative one, the melancholy one. He felt a wave of nausea. Could Clara Vance have been so meticulous, so methodical, to not just kill these women, but to preserve their likeness, their very essence, in this way? Their last stop was an old, dilapidated storage unit in a seedy part of Buffalo. The auction record showed that the remaining 3 mannequins had been purchased by a small, independent film company that specialized in low-budget horror. The company had since gone bankrupt, and its assets, including the mannequins, had been moved to the storage unit. Miles and Reyes entered the unit, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The mannequins were in a row, covered in dusty sheets, their forms like silent sentinels in the gloom. Miles pulled back the first sheet. A woman with a terrified expression on her face stared back at him, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. The next one was a woman with a desperate, pleading look, her hands raised as if to ward off a blow. The last one, a woman with a face of pure, frozen horror, her eyes wide with shock. It was a gallery of terror. Each mannequin represented a different stage of a victim's descent into fear. Miles felt a fresh wave of nausea. He realized what Clara Vance had done. She had not just created a single masterpiece. She had created a series, a terrifying narrative in mannequin form. Emily's mannequin was the climax, the final pose of raw, unadulterated terror. The others were the prelude. Miles had a horrifying thought. What if the scratch on Emily's mannequin wasn't a clue but a confession? What if the E was not for Emily, but for something else? What if it was a symbol, an artistic signature that Clara Vance had left on all of her muses? They checked the other mannequins. Beneath the cuff of the terrified one, a faint scratch in the shape of a C. The pleading one, an A. The one with the face of horror, an L. The others, the ones in the museum and the private collection, had similar faint etchings. The C, L, A, R, and A. Clara Vance's signature, hidden in plain sight. It was a chilling discovery, a final, arrogant taunt from a brilliant, twisted mind. Clara Vance had not only killed these women and created their likenesses, she had signed her work. The mannequins weren't just a testament to her art, they were a testament to her crimes. The final piece of the puzzle, however, was still missing. Where were the bodies? Miles was certain that the answer, like everything else, was buried in Clara Vance's meticulously planned, twisted art. The discovery of the other mannequins and the hidden initials sent a shockwave through the Oakhaven Police Department. The case, once a local curiosity, was now a multi-jurisdictional investigation spanning decades. Miles and Reyes were now chasing down the ghosts of 5 women, all of whom had been art students, amateur models, or simply people with a passion for art, and all of whom had vanished without a trace, their disappearances never linked. The media, sensing a story of epic proportions, descended on Oakhaven. The small, quiet town was suddenly under a blinding spotlight. The pressure was immense. The 5 families who had lived for years with the gnawing uncertainty of a missing loved one were now forced to relive their nightmares, albeit with a new, horrifying twist. Miles, however, remained focused. He was no longer just a detective. He was a custodian of these women's stories, a seeker of the truth that had been so cruelly taken from them. He spent his days in the precinct, surrounded by old files, photographs, and Clara's chilling journals. He read and reread every entry, searching for a clue, a symbol, a throwaway line that would reveal her final act. He began to see the journals not as a narrative, but as a map. Every description of her art, every mention of her techniques seemed to contain a veiled reference to something else. Her obsession with preservation and immortality wasn't just a metaphor, it was a horrifying mission statement. She didn't just want to create a work of art in their image, Miles said to Reyes one night, staring at a schematic of the old boutique. She wanted to make them a part of her art, a part of the building itself. Reyes, who was meticulously cross-referencing names and dates, looked up. "What do you mean?" "The sweet, cloying smell," Miles said, his mind racing. "The one we noticed in the boutique and in her studio. It wasn't just perfume. It was a preservative, something used to keep things from decaying. And her journals. She mentions a new kind of primer she developed, a substance that would make her sculptures truly timeless." Miles's theory was grim, but it fit the horrifying puzzle. Clara Vance wasn't just a mannequin maker, she was a macabre taxidermist. She was preserving her victims, not just in their likeness, but in their very bodies, using a unique and probably toxic substance. But where were they? Where would she hide 5 bodies, preserved in this way, in a building that had been searched, however perfunctorily, years ago? Miles looked at the schematic of the building. The boutique was a 2-story structure with a small basement. The search of the main floor in the studio had yielded nothing. The basement had been flooded for years, and the old reports noted that it was filled with junk and was structurally unsound. The police had dismissed it as a potential crime scene. "The basement," Miles said, the word a whisper. "Reyes, get a team down there. I want them to pump the water out. I don't care about the structural integrity. I want them to look for anything at all. A secret room, a hidden wall, anything that could have been used to conceal something." Reyes looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and grim determination. "A flooded basement, sir? For 18 years, nothing could have survived that." "You'd be surprised," Miles replied, thinking of Clara's obsession with preservation. She was an artist. She would have had a solution, a way to protect her masterpieces. She wrote about creating impervious vessels for her timeless art. I think she was referring to the containers she used to store the bodies. The next day, a team of engineers and firemen, under Miles's direction, began the grueling task of pumping the water out of the basement. The smell that rose from the depths of the building was a putrid mix of mildew, stagnant water, and that same faint, cloying sweetness. As the water level slowly receded, the true state of the basement was revealed. It was a maze of old crates, rusted furniture, and a thick layer of sludge. It took a full day to get the water out, and when it was finally done, the team was met with a chilling sight. The basement had been meticulously organized despite the flood. There were 5 large metallic containers, each one sealed with a series of heavy bolts. They were positioned in a circle around a central point in the middle of the room. The craftsmanship was impressive, the seams perfectly welded. The containers were designed to be airtight and waterproof. "Holy hell," Reyes whispered, his flashlight beam trembling over the containers. "She built these herself." Miles nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. She was a genius, Reyes. A twisted, horrifying genius. Miles called in the forensics team. They took samples from the containers, the sludge around them, and the air. The results were immediate and conclusive. The air inside the containers contained traces of a unique formaldehyde-based preservation mixture, a formula that was highly toxic and designed for long-term preservation of organic material. And the sludge around the containers was filled with traces of human remains. Miles walked slowly to the first container. There was no going back now. The moment of truth had arrived. He looked at Reyes, and they both knew what they had to do. With a grim nod, they got to work, unscrewing the heavy bolts. The screech of metal was deafening in the silence of the basement. Miles carefully pried open the lid of the first container. A rush of putrid, sweet-smelling air assaulted his senses. He recoiled, his hand flying to his mouth. When he looked inside, his heart froze. It wasn't a body. It was a series of plaster casts. A full-body cast of a woman, a delicate face, a slender hand. Each part was meticulously labeled and wrapped. They weren't bodies, they were molds, the tools of a macabre artist, the raw material for her masterpieces. He checked the other containers. They were all the same. Each one contained the plaster casts of the women she had killed. Miles felt a fresh wave of despair. The bodies were not here. They had to be somewhere else. He had been so sure. The journals, the smell, the containers, it all pointed to this place. But she had been one step ahead, even from the grave. She had created a diversion, a false lead, to throw off anyone who might come looking. "We were wrong," Reyes said, his voice laced with defeat. "The bodies aren't here. Where else could she have put them?" Miles looked around the basement, his eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling. Then he saw it. A series of small ventilation shafts, leading up from the basement and into the walls of the main floor. They were too small for a person, but maybe not for a... "The mannequins," Miles said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "The mannequins in the store, the ones she created. We checked them, but we didn't check them properly. They weren't just models, they were their crypts." They rushed back upstairs to where the first mannequin had been found. Forensics technicians were still on site, meticulously collecting samples. Miles, with a fresh wave of determination, gave the order. "Get a scan, a full body scan of that mannequin. I want to know what's inside it. Now." The technicians set up a portable X-ray machine. The scan was quick, the results appearing on a small screen in a few minutes. Miles and Reyes leaned in, their hearts pounding. The image was a hazy, blurry mess, but the outline was unmistakable. The distinct shape of a human skeleton, a full body, was visible inside the mannequin. The bones were encased in a thick, dense substance, and the skull was eerily visible, a silent testament to a life brutally cut short. Miles felt a wave of cold triumph. He was right. Clara Vance hadn't just made mannequins, she had made tombs. She hadn't just created an artistic masterpiece, she had created an eternal monument to her crimes. The truth, in all its horrifying, macabre glory, was finally unveiled. And now, Miles and Reyes had to give these 5 women the dignity of their names, the justice they had been denied for so long, and the rest they deserved. The discovery of Emily Clark's remains inside the mannequin was a grim and shocking revelation that sent shockwaves far beyond the confines of Oakhaven. The media frenzy was unprecedented. The story of the mannequin killer dominated national headlines, turning the quiet, forgotten town into a macabre tourist attraction. For Miles and Reyes, the grim discovery was just the beginning. Forensics teams, working around the clock, began the painstaking process of extracting Emily's remains from the mannequin. The preservative compound Clara Vance had used was highly toxic and dense, making the work slow and dangerous. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as asphyxiation, likely with a toxic substance, a horrifying confirmation of Miles's theory. The masterpiece had indeed been a death mask, a final chilling act of control. With the first body identified, the task of identifying the others became paramount. Miles and Reyes, armed with their new theory, revisited the other mannequins. The first one, in the local museum, was X-rayed. The image on the screen was a perfect, ghostly replica of the mannequin's exterior, a faint human skeleton within. The curators were horrified. The museum immediately shut down, and the mannequin was moved to the precinct for a full forensic examination. The second one, in the private collection, was a more difficult endeavor. The collector, a frail, elderly man, initially refused to believe them. He had cherished the piece, seen it as a work of genius. Miles had to be blunt, showing him the X-ray of Emily's mannequin. The old man, his face pale with shock, finally relented. He was a victim in his own way, a blind admirer of a murderer's grotesque art. The last 3, in the storage unit, were already at the precinct. Each one was scanned, and each one yielded the same result: a full, skeletal human body encased in a thick, dense preservative. Miles felt a wave of both grim satisfaction and profound sorrow. He had found them. 5 women, lost for decades, were finally found, hidden in plain sight, their stories silenced by a meticulous, calculating killer. The next step was to identify them. The skeletal remains, while preserved, had no distinguishing features beyond what Clara Vance had so chillingly replicated on the mannequin's exterior. Miles and Reyes, armed with the journal and the notes from the original missing persons reports, began the long, arduous process of matching the remains to the missing women. They started with the most recent disappearance, Emily Clark, whose identity was confirmed by dental records from her family dentist. The other 4 were more difficult. The old missing persons reports were vague, and the families had long moved on, or were deceased. Miles, with the help of the FBI, began a national search for women who had vanished in the years leading up to Emily's disappearance, using the journals and the descriptions of Clara's muses as their guide. The clues were subtle, but they were there. In one entry, Clara described her muse of serenity, a woman with a calm demeanor and a love of the city's old Art Deco architecture. Miles and Reyes dug through the missing persons reports from that era and found a woman named Claire Johnson, a quiet art history student who had disappeared from her New York City apartment building, which was a well-known Art Deco landmark. Another journal entry described the melancholy muse, a young woman with a passion for poetry and a troubled home life. They found a missing persons report for a woman named Lena Peterson, a poet who had left her home after a family dispute and was never heard from again. The remaining 2 were even harder to identify. One was described as the pensive muse, a woman with a thoughtful expression and a passion for philosophy. The last one, the mannequin with the terrified face, was described as the final pose, a young woman who had a vibrant spirit but a deep-seated fear of being alone. Miles and Reyes, with the help of a dedicated team of detectives, worked for weeks, cross-referencing, calling old contacts and digging through the darkest corners of forgotten case files. They spoke to old friends, distant relatives, and retired police officers, weaving together a tapestry of 5 lives that had been brutally and meticulously taken. The puzzle was finally coming together. They had names, stories, and faces to match to the macabre mannequins. The women were Claire Johnson, Lena Peterson, Amelia Rose, Beatrice Young, and of course, Emily Clark. They were all young women, all with an artistic passion, and all had a connection to the world of art and sculpture. They were Clara Vance's victims, her muses, a testament to her grotesque artistic vision. Miles felt a profound sense of sadness as he looked at the photographs of the 5 women. They were so vibrant, so full of life, and their stories had been silenced for so long. He looked at Emily's smiling face in the old photograph, her bright blue eyes, now hauntingly replicated in glass. She had walked into a trap, a willing subject in a twisted game of art and control. The media, of course, ran with the story, a new headline every day. The names and faces of the 5 victims were plastered on every news channel. The families, some of whom had only just been notified, were now grieving in the public eye. The town of Oakhaven, once a quiet, unassuming place, was now infamous. Miles, however, ignored the noise. He had a different mission. He was not just a detective, he was a restorer of dignity. He was going to give these women back their names, their stories, and their final resting places. He arranged for a memorial service, a quiet, private affair for the families and the police officers who had worked the case. The service was held in a small, local chapel. The 5 coffins, now filled with the remains of the 5 women, were lined up in a row. Miles stood in the back, watching the families say their final goodbyes. The pain was palpable, but so was the sense of closure. After decades of not knowing, they finally had answers. As the service ended, a young man, a reporter from one of the major news networks, approached Miles. "Detective Corbin, can you give us a quote? How does it feel to finally close a case that has been cold for so long?" Miles looked at him, his gaze firm. "This isn't a story," he said. "This is a tragedy. And we didn't solve a cold case. We just found 5 women who were lost, and we're going to make sure they're never forgotten again." He turned and walked away, leaving the reporter to scramble for a follow-up question. Miles knew that the world would move on, that the headlines would fade, and that the story would become a grim footnote in the annals of true crime. But for him, and for the families of the 5 victims, their memory would live on. They were not just a series of macabre mannequins. They were Claire, Lena, Amelia, Beatrice, and Emily. They were people, and their stories had finally been told. The national media spotlight on Oakhaven eventually waned, but the quiet town was forever changed. The old Bell's boutique, once a curiosity, was now a grim landmark. The 5 mannequins, stripped of their gruesome contents, were now evidence in a closed case, a testament to a horrific crime. For Miles, the resolution of the case brought little comfort. The weight of what he had uncovered settled on his shoulders, a heavy, somber burden. The official reports were filed, the case was closed, and the families of the 5 victims were beginning the long, difficult process of healing. But for Miles, the case wasn't truly over. He was haunted by the faces of the 5 women, the stories he had pieced together, and the chilling meticulousness of Clara Vance's crimes. He felt a personal responsibility to their memory, a silent promise to ensure they were not forgotten. He found solace in a small, unexpected way. Emily Clark's parents, in a gesture of gratitude and grief, had gifted him Emily's sketchbook. They said they couldn't bear to keep it, but they felt it should be with the man who had given their daughter her dignity back. Miles accepted it with reverence, the worn pages feeling like a fragile piece of history in his hands. He kept the sketchbook in a drawer in his office, a silent reminder of the case that had changed him. In the quiet moments of his day, he would open it, looking at Emily's beautiful sketches, her portraits of laughter and sadness, her poignant study of the mannequin. He was no longer looking at it as a detective, but as a student of a life that had been cut short. He saw her passion, her talent, and her naivete. He saw the girl who had been so full of life, so excited for her future, so ready to be a muse. The sketchbook became a symbol for him, a reminder of the human cost of his work. He was no longer just a cop who solved crimes. He was a guardian of lost stories, a voice for the voiceless. The experience had profoundly changed him, pushing him to be more than just a public servant. He started volunteering at a local youth art center, a place where he could see young people full of passion and potential, learning and growing. He wanted to do something, anything, to honor Emily's memory, to ensure that no other artist would ever be preyed upon in the same way. He also found a new kind of friendship with Sergeant Reyes. The younger officer, who had been so green and hesitant at the beginning of the case, had proven his mettle. He had stood by Miles, unwavering, through the grisly discoveries and the media circus. They had a shared experience, a silent understanding of the darkness they had uncovered. Their bond was not one of just colleagues, but of two people who had faced something terrible and come out on the other side, forever changed. Reyes, for his part, was also grappling with the aftermath. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also seen the best, in Miles's unwavering dedication and the strength of the families who had found closure. He had been so focused on the technicalities of the case, but Miles had taught him to see the humanity in it. He started to look at his own cases, not just as files and reports, but as stories of people who needed a voice. Life in Oakhaven slowly returned to a semblance of normal. The curious tourists eventually moved on, the news vans left, and the town's quiet rhythm resumed. But the memory of the 5 women and the man who found them lingered, a quiet, almost reverent part of the town's history. The people of Oakhaven, once so disconnected, had come together in a shared moment of grief and understanding. The case, as grim as it was, had a strange, unifying effect. Miles, however, could not forget. The mannequin with the glass eyes still haunted his dreams. He would see Emily's face, her beautiful, haunting expression, and he would feel the weight of her story. He knew he would carry it with him forever, but he no longer saw it as a burden. It was a purpose. One evening, as he was sitting in his office, looking at the city lights twinkling in the rain-slicked streets, Reyes came in, holding a small box. "Detective," he said, his voice soft. "Something came for you." Miles opened the box. Inside was a small, ornate wooden carving. It was a miniature of a mannequin, not the chillingly lifelike ones from the case, but a beautiful, serene one, carved from a single piece of oak. It was a gift from Thomas and Eleanor Clark, Emily's parents. The carving was a tribute to the man who had found their daughter and a symbol of their gratitude. Miles held the carving in his hands, the smooth wood feeling warm and solid. It was a gesture of love, a symbol of hope in the face of so much darkness. He looked at the carving, and then he looked at the sketchbook in his desk. He saw the beautiful art of Emily Clark, the talent that had been so cruelly taken from the world. He saw the kindness of her parents, who had found a way to move on from their grief. And he saw the promise of a new kind of purpose for himself. He would continue to work, to solve cases, to bring justice to those who needed it. But he would do so with a new kind of empathy, a new kind of understanding. He would remember the 5 women not as victims, but as people. He would remember Emily, not just as a lost girl, but as a talented artist whose final work was a haunting, powerful message that finally, after all these years, found an audience. He would remember her not for her tragic end, but for the life she had lived, the art she had created, and the story she had left behind. Years passed, and Oakhaven's fame as the site of the Mannequin killer faded into a grim footnote of local history. The old Belle's boutique was torn down, replaced by a modern apartment building. Yet for Miles, the case had not faded. It had become part of his life's fabric, turning him from a detective into a guardian of the 5 women's memory. Miles was promoted to chief of detectives, his reputation for empathy and meticulousness earning him respect throughout the department. He implemented new cold case protocols, directly inspired by his experience with the Clark case, and used his position to advocate for modern technology and inter-agency cooperation. His work had a tangible impact, leading to the closure of several long-dormant cases. His bond with Reyes, who also rose through the ranks, remained strong, built on a shared understanding of the darkness they had faced. In his new role, Miles took on a personal project, a detailed narrative of the case, not a police report. He included every chilling detail, the journals, the sketches, the victims' stories, writing a cautionary tale and a tribute. This private manuscript was his way of processing the trauma and ensuring the story lived on respectfully. He also remained in close contact with Emily Clark's parents, who, with his help, established a foundation in Emily's name to provide scholarships for art students. Miles became a silent, dedicated partner in their mission, helping them turn their grief into a positive legacy. One afternoon, while packing his office, Miles rediscovered Emily's old sketchbook. As he opened it, the pages still held the power to move him. He saw Emily's talent, her dreams, and her quiet vulnerability. He saw the mannequin drawings, from a beautiful muse to a horrified captive, and her final terrifying self-portrait. In that moment, he knew his work was not just about catching a killer, but about giving a voice to the victims. He had given Emily's story a new ending, one of dignity and remembrance, transforming a tragedy into a legacy of hope. He decided to share the story, publishing his manuscript as The Final Pose. The book was a critical success, praised for its raw honesty and humanistic approach. It brought renewed purpose to the Emily Clark Foundation and made Miles an unexpected national figure. He used the platform not for personal gain, but to promote his message. Every case, no matter how cold, has a human story at its heart. Miles eventually retired, content to live in Oakhaven, where the ghosts of the past no longer haunted him. Instead, they were part of his life, a silent, powerful reminder of the work he had done. He would often walk by the spot where the old boutique once stood, thinking of Emily Clark. He had given a ghost a voice and brought a hidden truth to light, and in doing so he had found his own peace. The girl with the glass eyes had finally found her peace, and so had he. Decades passed. Miles Corbin was a retired legend, his legacy as a compassionate and brilliant investigator etched into the department's history. He lived a quiet, reflective life on the outskirts of Oakhaven, surrounded by books and memories. Reyes, now the chief of police, remained a close friend, often visiting to share updates and talk about their shared past. One day, Reyes brought an old, dust-covered box from the department's evidence locker. It was a drawing, a portrait found on Clara Vance's easel that had been overlooked for years. Miles opened the box, his hands trembling. Inside was a beautiful, haunting charcoal image of a young man, no older than 17, with dark, intense eyes and a faint, sad smile. The likeness was chillingly perfect. It was a portrait of a young Thomas Clark, Emily's father. Miles was stunned. There had been no mention of a connection in Clara's journals. The portrait was a clue that had been sitting unseen for decades. He immediately called Thomas Clark, now in his 90s, and asked the question that was now consuming him. Thomas's voice, frail but clear, revealed a secret he had kept for a lifetime. Clara Vance. Yes, I knew her. We were in art school together. We had a friendship. We were in love. He explained how his family had disapproved, wanting him to take over their carpentry business in Oakhaven. He had broken it off with Clara, who was devastated and left without a word. Miles felt a profound sense of sorrow. The truth, in all its bitter, ironic glory, was finally revealed. Clara Vance was not a random killer. She was a brilliant, disturbed artist, scorned by the man she loved. Her obsession with art was a perversion of her love for Thomas. The Muses were a macabre tribute to his life, a twisted commentary on the peaceful life she felt he had denied her. Emily, with her vibrant spirit and uncanny resemblance to her father, was the final, cruelest act of revenge, the love he had chosen over her, now a canvas for her pain. Miles and Reyes sat in silence, looking at the portrait. The case was no longer just a crime. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, a story of love, betrayal, and a monstrous revenge. Miles kept the portrait, a final, quiet piece of the puzzle. The case was officially closed, but for Miles, the story would always be a part of him. He had found the truth, not just about a crime, but about the human heart in all its beauty and terrible darkness. He had found a legacy, a purpose, and a truth that would stay with him until his last breath.